by Eric Whitehead. Prologue. An unseasonably cool dusk had settled over suburban Moscow, and the grounds outside the Lenin Palace of Sports were deserted except for a platoon of Red Army soldiers on the asphalt perimeter. Attired in their drab gray uniforms with the red lapel tabs, they slouched at ease in ranks three deep, on call for what in the Soviet Union is a euphemistically termed crowd control duty. Rested in the autumn chill, the soldiers shifted with the muffled swell of the crowd noises that thrummed through the walls of the arena. Inside were 14,000 hockey fans, were jammed around the brightly lit rink. The din was at an edgy, rousish pitch, and the place reeked with tension. Da da Canada, niet niet Soviet. Da da Canada, niet niet Soviet. The roar from the 3,000 strong contingent of the Canadians at the northern end was more of a challenge than a chant. The answering Russian roar of Shibu Shibu was angry, defensive. The hockey fans in Moscow had never before seen anything quite like this aggressive, uninhibited show of the Western style emotion. It puzzled them. They neither understood nor liked it. It was the same and a lot more so down on the ice, where the passions were rooted in a bitter and sometimes ugly East-West confrontation. There at this moment, Esposito, the Canadian, and Ragulin, the Russian, came crashing together in a corner. Players of both teams converged on the scene with sticks high and elbows slashing, and the stands were bedlam. In a seat midway up the east center section, Frederick Wellington Taylor, OBE, otherwise known to millions of Canadians as just plain Cyclone, showed no signs of emotion other than a tightening of his grip on the black Homburg that lay in his lap. His face gaunt, high-boned, deeply etched with the lines of his 88 years, was expressionless. A few rows below, in the heavily guarded equivalent of the Western-style royal box, Alexei Kosygin was equally inscrutable. Yet both the visitor from Canada and the premier of the USSR were uneasily aware of the tension, which had a strange, brooding, unsettling quality. Certainly Taylor had experienced nothing quite like it in his own lifetime in hockey as a pioneer and patriarch. He could lay down at a Canadian bench and see that the raw nerve ends, frayed by weeks of bitter, gnawing frustration, were at the snapping point. Harry Sinden had quit the traditional coach's beat behind the bench and was up at the wooden barrier with his players, slamming his fist against the side and screaming epithets at the West German referee, Franz Batter, who slid by, tight-lipped and unheeding. Sinden's fiery aide, John Ferguson, was up on the empty bench, arms akimbo, cursing volubly to himself as Phil Esposito lumbered sullenly toward the penalty box. Batter had seen Esposito high-stick Ragulin and bring blood trickling down from a cut under the Russian's right eye. Sinden was screaming that Batter had not seen or had chosen not to see Ragulin's hold and elbowing, or the subtly applied Russian kicks that had bruised and lacerated the ankles of his players. As the gate of the penalty box slammed shut on the glowering, outraged Esposito, the incentive increased, now led by a furious John Ferguson, who was up at the barrier with Sinden. "You chicken-livered crowd," he screamed. "You gutless bastard." He thumped at the boards, and towels came flying onto the ice from the Canadian bench. The West German official skated up, white-faced, jabbed a finger at Ferguson, indicating a bench penalty, then skated off again. Moments later, Batter's whistle shrilled through the pandemonium that rocked the arena, and play was restarted. Deep in trouble, as they had been so many times during this extraordinary series, the Canadians were trying desperately to hang on to a 3-2 lead that just minutes before had been 3-1, and the relentless Russians were again turning it on. This was Moscow, September 23rd, 1972, Game 6 of the first historic Team Canada vs. USSR duel. The blistering 8th game that was destined to cap the most dramatic comeback in hockey history would get the ultimate raves and would always be best remembered. But it was this sixth confrontation, the second game in Moscow at their four in Canada, that had turned the tide. Lose this one, and the Russians had the series. The two remaining contests would be a meaningless exercise in futility. With the Canadian humiliation complete, the USSR, the new kid on the block, would be number one. Cyclone Taylor had his own private thoughts about these turbulent nights in the Lenin Palace of Sports, and they were mixed. He admired the swift style of the Russians and their marvelous disciplined pattern play, graced as it was with all the basic skills of skating and puck handling. Much of what he saw in them, especially the electrifying Valery Kharlamov, was what the fans saw in Taylor himself. And as he had been 70, or Lord, was it 100 years ago, when the excitement he generated packed arenas in Ottawa, Montreal, Pittsburgh, Vancouver, and yes, in New York and Boston, long before the birth of the National Hockey League. He greatly admired the Canadian players for their spirit and fearlessness and freewheeling abandon, other qualities he could recall firsthand from a long time ago. But he was openly disturbed by the Canadian style, growing accent on unnecessary roughness and disregard for personal discipline to the detriment of the skills. It was that he had anything against rough bruising. It wasn't that he had anything against rough, bruising, bone-rattling hockey, which he was personally very familiar. His quarrel was with the chippy stuff and the elbowing and butting and spearing and fighting that could be tactical suicide against an able opponent. As he saw it, it deemed the natural beauty of the sport as it destroyed the effective rhythm of play in practical terms, as here and now against the cagey Russians, an inevitably byproduct of dumb penalties could kill you. Alexander Yakushev wheeled in, flew down the boards, and then flicked a picture pass of Kharlamov right at the crease. A quick whip of Kharlamov's wrist, and the Canadian goalie Ken Dryden, flat on the ice, looked around for a red light, but it did not go on. Wherever the puck may have split between before and the back of the goal, or slipping back off the post, it was now suddenly somehow in Dryden's glove, and there was no goal. At full strength now, Team Canada had miraculously survived the double penalty, and the north end of the arena was again bedlam. Da, Canada, niet, Soviet. Taylor marveled at the thrill of all as he surveyed the scene around him, daylight of which he had not seen before and would likely not see again. You could look back in there or see at the west end. You could look out there and see where the east ended and the west began. Right there, that line in the stands where the drab gray, browns, and blacks of the Russian fans suddenly gave way to the brilliant hues, reds, blues, greens, and the wild checkerboard patterns of the infidels. It was a sight to see, this scene from a whole new world of hockey, and he marveled too at the stroke of fortune that had brought him here. It had been just after 10 o'clock on the morning, a little more than a week ago, when the phone rang in his Vancouver apartment. On the line was his old friend, Arthur Lang, a former cabinet minister who had just a month been appointed to the Senate. "Psych," said the senator, heading a small, informal diplomatic delegation to Moscow for the Team Canada series. "I'd like to have you as our guest. Will you come?" There was a slight pause from the Vancouver end of the line. Maybe all of the spirit second, and then, "Will I come? Arthur, you know I'm no diplomat and I don't own a silk hat, but you bet I'll come, my goodness, yes." 4 days later, Taylor was on the Lang party of 7, who were met at the Moscow airport by the welcoming party, headed by the Canadian ambassador of the USSR, Robert Ford, and several Soviet dignitaries. The quarters provided for the Canadian party's stay in Moscow were in the two of the settlement of the 15 luxury residences known in the English translation as the mansions. Tucked into a lovely suburban area in the Lenin Hills, the mansions had been built by Nikita Khrushchev for his favorite ministers and was an opulent retreat. The hospitality was lavish and the service magnificent. And Taylor, as usual, in his travels, was accorded a special respect by the Russian host. It was evident here that part of the man's appeal as an enduring celebrity was the general fascination with his age framed, and it was a sparkling vitality and wry humor. This probably accounted for the rare social note that had appeared in the Communist Party newspaper Pravda hailing the arrival in Moscow. The note expressed sincere welcome to the great hockey hero, Mr. Cyclone Taylor, who is 98 years old. This was perhaps just an innocent exaggeration born of the quaint Russian obsession with longevity. There were recurrent reports of some humble woodcutter or farmer, some secure Soviet providence, who was claimed to have celebrated his 130th or 140th birthday. Taylor, although certainly a senior citizen, is hard pressed to match that sort of thing even in myth. He himself has some understanding of the Russians, and he had been here before. It had been 14 years earlier that Taylor first visited Russia with a British Columbia senior, a team called Kelowna Packers. It had been 14 years earlier that Taylor first visited Russia with a British Columbia Senior A team called the Kelowna Packers. On his return, he had penned these prophetic words: "If Canadians don't accept the Russian challenge and put new life in their game from the junior ranks up, then I would say this with an intense desire to beat the West, Russia will eventually match and perhaps outclass the best in Canada, and that includes the National Hockey League." How soon would this happen? Within perhaps a decade, the next 10 or 12 years span. Had he been anyone but the patriarch of hockey, widely revered as the game's first superstar, and had been perhaps 20 years younger, he might well have been stoned in the streets. Instead, the reaction of his countrymen ranged from outrage to amused tolerance. Now, before his eyes, the gloomy prophecy was fulfilled. Down on the ice, Soviets were boring in on sit-ins and battle penalty killers. Down on the ice, the Soviets were boring in on sit-ins and battle penalty killers, sending wave after wave over the blue line, taking crackling hits from Sir Savard and Gary Bergman. The scoreboard The scoreboard that hung high over the drama of this second game in Moscow still reads Canada 3, URSS 2. In the north end of the arena was bedlam as the fans were up and roaring at the sudden swing of the tide. The Russians had missed their chance to put it away, both the game and the series. Having miraculously survived the penalties, Team Canada was now forcing the play, and the aroused Canadians were swarming furiously around the Soviet goal as the whistle blew to end the second period. The game officials were off the ice in a flash, scurrying through the gate at the north end of the rink, with batter out in front, fleeing for the safety of their dressing room. Quick as they were, Sinden and Ferguson were close behind, accompanied by ailing star, who was here only as a spectator, Bobby Orr. The Canadian fans gaped and cheered wildly as the trio flew up the runway that led into the stands, screaming to get at the retreating officials. Before they could, a swarm of Soviet police providentially closed in and halted the chase. Taylor sat watching this little drama until it disappeared from his view, and the grim-faced Team Canada players followed by the stoic Russians also exited up the ramp. Guys, please. He stayed in the seat a few moments longer, pondering the night's remarkable events. It was like nothing had ever been seen or felt. Then, as Senator Lang and his party rose to leave, he followed them into the aisle, through a concourse toward the private room provided for them between periods, using use of the dignitaries. Premier Costigan had already left with his party, conveyed by plainclothesmen of the NKV, the state police. En route to the VIP room, Taylor gazed around the crowded rotunda and recalled his previous visit here in 1958 with the Kelowna Packers. He vividly remembered his amazement and delight in his finding that 1907 photo of himself in Ottawa Senator strip hung in the Hall of Fame wall, otherwise decorated with the USSR's own hockey heroes. He wondered now if the photo was still there, or if the display had just been temporary courtesy to mark his first visit. Around him, he moved past the drably attired Russian fans, thronged around the concession stand, munching on their fat, steaming sausages, with so many echoes of his thoughts of 14 years ago when he had foreseen the Soviet challenge that surfaced here in 1972. Arriving at the door of the VIP room, he was met with a deferentially ushered inside. He was met and deferentially ushered inside by a Soviet official. The sparsely furnished area was dominated by a long table laden with a buffet featuring the Russian snack staples of caviar and smoked salmon. There, and at an upper, smaller table scattered around the room, were generous supplies of other Soviet staple vodka. The president of the Soviet Ice Hockey Association and lesser dignitaries and officials were already there, cooked and ready for any toast that might be prepared. Cocked and ready for any toast that might be proposed. Toasts were and always have been a little awkward for Fred Taylor, a lifetime teetotaler who will go no further than a glass of ginger ale. However, there was really nothing to toast, at least not yet, what with the result of the edgy confrontation still in uneasy limbo. Midway during a rather stained and tentative soiree, the door opened and in came Alexei Kosygin and his party for the surprise visit. Deference immediately became the order of the day, especially among the cluster of Soviet officials. There were introductions, polite small talk, and there was the top man being introduced to Taylor. Although Kosygin does speak some stilted English and understands more, he prefers to converse through an interpreter. And to Taylor he said, "You are enjoying the game?" "To be honest, Mr. Premier," said Taylor, "I'm not quite sure. I hope you'll ask me again later on." The heavy black brows arched a little, and his eyes, usually so somber and calculating, twinkled. "Why?" asked Kosygin. "Are you not playing tonight?" "Mr. Premier," said Taylor, "I'll tell you this. It's not because I don't want to." Kosygin chuckled appreciatively. "I'm told that you are a great hockey star in your country." Well, Mr. Premier, replied Taylor impishly, "I'm certainly not going to quarrel with you about that. The Russian chief like that. The Russian chief like that." And he laughed again. "But I think," he said, "that was a long time ago." "Yes," said Taylor softly, "it was a long time ago." 17 minutes to read this prologue. Cyclone Taylor. I will continue reading another time. Thank you.